Today is Thursday, November 4th. This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in today's talk I'd like to address a topic that comes up in discussions quite a bit, very reasonable topic, one that parents certainly should be asking as they consider how to educate their children. And the question is, why should we study the classical Catholic curriculum in 2021? Why should we study the classical Catholic curriculum in 2021, in the information age, in a high-tech, competitive, global economy where Catholic parents are working to prepare their children for success in a modern society, a high-tech, competitive, capitalistic society? Why would a family choose, in that context, to study the classical Catholic curriculum? And like I said, that's a great question, and one that's worthy of discussion. Now, what I'd like to ask you to think about are four options that we have. Four different options. And I'd like to discuss each of these four options because this is how I like to think through these questions as a parent. The first option would be to raise children who did not have a classical Catholic education and who did not obtain the academic credentials of modern society. So that would include a high school diploma, good standardized test scores, college degree, etc. The first option would be to raise children who had neither a classical Catholic education nor modern academic credentials. That's option number one. Option number two would be to raise children who did not have a classical Catholic education but did obtain modern academic credentials, good standardized test scores, high school diploma, college degree, and so on. The third option would be to raise a child or children who have a classical Catholic education but do not have modern academic credentials. They study to learn the classical liberal arts, they study classical philosophy, they study Catholic theology, but they don't pursue modern academic credentials, not concerned with standardized testing, or they score poorly because they don't prepare for standardized testing, not concerned with a high school diploma, which, by the way, is not necessary, aren't interested in college studies, don't obtain a college degree, but, as I said, have a classical Catholic education. And then the fourth option, which is to have a classical Catholic education and obtain modern academic credentials, to have a classical Catholic education, be dedicated to classical Catholic studies, while also obtaining modern academic credentials, doing well on standardized tests, obtaining a high school diploma, being admitted to a selective college or university, obtaining college degree, and so on. So 4 different options we have to discuss when we ask why should a student in 2021 pursue the study of classical Catholic education in modern 21st century society. So there are 4 options, and if we consider the 4 options, obviously the first option would be the least desirable. The first option would be to neither pursue a classical Catholic education nor obtain modern academic credentials. That would be the worst of all 4 options, and many speak critically of modern academic credentials, but they usually do so when it's time to work for them. They don't do so when it's time to use them. They criticize modern academic credentials when it's time to work for them, when it's time to sacrifice for them, when it's time to pay for them. They criticize academic credentials, but when it's time to look for a job, suddenly we're trying to put together a resume that is impressive to employers. And we have to admit, it sure would be helpful if there were some modern academic credentials on that resume. But as I said, we criticize these things when it's time to earn them, because we don't want to do the work. Or some may say, I've already got my career planned out for me, and my career plans don't require academic credentials. I would hope that that was true. Or someone may say, I just want to be a housewife. I'm not concerned about having a classical education or modern academic credentials. Or someone might say, I want to pursue a religious vocation. I'm not interested in classical Catholic education. It's not necessary. Nor am I concerned about modern academic credentials. The problem with all of those arguments is that I'm not so sure that they're true. I'm not sure, for example, that one can be a better housewife without a classical Catholic education and without modern academic credentials. Now you may say, well, my mother didn't go to college, only finished 8th grade, and she's fine. And that may be true, but I bet there aren't many women like your mother. Plus, I bet if you ask your mother, she would tell you that she wishes that she had the opportunity to do things that she didn't do. I don't think that she would defend her 8th grade education as the best plan for life. As for religious vocations, religion is often used, today at least, as an excuse to study and work less than other students, when in the past, religious vocations were the reason why young men chose to study more. And I think that if someone is talking about a religious vocation, and that talk leads them to think less of classical Catholic education, we'd have to ask, what saints or doctors of the Church are they consulting for this opinion? Because there's no saint or doctor of the Church who would ever recommend that someone not pursue a classical Catholic education for a religious vocation. And I don't really think we need to talk much about this first option. I don't think there's anyone homeschooling who would say that they don't care about a classical Catholic education, and they also don't care about modern academic credentials. The second option was to go without a classical Catholic education and to pursue modern academic credentials alone. And this is very common today. This is what just about everyone today is doing. Just about everyone is pursuing modern academic credentials, good standardized test scores, high school diploma, college degree, rather than study the classical Catholic curriculum. Good example of this would be Seton homeschool, modern Catholic schools, the public schools, modern Protestant schools, and so on. Any school that's arranged according to the K-12 grade level system is a school that's arranged with this purpose in mind. It's a choice to not pursue the classical Catholic curriculum and instead simply pursue modern academic credentials. Now, there's a problem with this plan. The modern academic credentials are presented as being in opposition to classical Catholic studies. And modern academic credentials are presented as being supportive of a modern K-12 educational program that focuses on 5 main subject areas: English language arts, math, science, history, or social studies, I should say, and foreign language. And most families, most parents, most schools, most students are focusing on that modern 5-subject curriculum in a K-12 program because they say that they're concerned with modern academic credentials, standardized tests, high school diploma, college admission, college degrees, and so on. We could even go farther and say career opportunities, employment, on and on. The problem with this position is that it's not true. It's very misleading. It seems like a good argument to say, we're not going to pursue classical Catholic studies because what we really need are these modern academic credentials because they bring us the most benefit after we're finished with our studies. But that's not true. First of all, one of the misleading influences in this modern school environment is that college education has become such a competitive business. It would be one thing if there was, let's say, the Ivy League. Let's say there were a dozen colleges spread out through the country, through the United States. And these colleges only admitted the best students from around the country. Let's say these 12 colleges had only 1,000 seats to offer, and out of the entire American population, only 12,000 seats in these selective universities were available each year, and all the students who wanted to go to college and get a college degree had to earn their way into one of these 12,000 exclusive seats in the great 12 universities. Things would be very different if that was the case. Admission would be very competitive. Students would have to begin preparing as early as possible and work very diligently to separate themselves from other candidates. And students would be looking for every opportunity that was available to do that. But in America, that's not what the college scene looks like, but rather, there are thousands and thousands of college programs that range from the very highest and most selective, like a Harvard University or Stanford, all the way down to private colleges or even community colleges that will admit anyone who pays tuition. And so it's like buying a car. If it was required that anyone who wanted a car pay cash for the car in full, then driving a luxury car might be an impressive sign of one's wealth. But once we realize that men can borrow money to buy cars, the car one drives says very little about how much money one actually has. The same is true with college. When anyone can, quote unquote, go to college, going to college no longer has any significance, and college degrees, likewise, lose their significance. They're no longer difficult to obtain. You can go to a private college and get a 4-year degree with no competition for admission. You can get C's in your classes and still obtain that college degree and claim that you've received that modern academic credential. You can say, there, I've completed my bachelor's degree in, let's say, education. I've completed my bachelor's degree in education. I've achieved my goal and obtained my academic credential. The problem is that's really not how degrees work. Once we move into the business world. Because the business world is competitive. And it knows that there is a difference. And people can attempt to badmouth elite colleges and universities. But if we look around at the most influential people in our society, we find that they all have connections to the elite schools, colleges, and universities. To say that these schools are irrelevant or that they don't matter is to simply deny reality. And it's just one of these modern arrogant habits of talking down anything that you don't have. But when it was time to apply to college, I'm sure that you would want to get into the best university possible. And we all know that there's a difference in the quality of universities. This isn't mere opinion. To go to a university that's got the best professors in the world who are leading the world's research projects and who have millions of dollars in grants and resources available, the latest technology and equipment, the best resources in terms of study materials and information systems. It's obvious that studying in such an environment is far better than to study at a local college that has none of those things and is merely selling degrees. The connections that a student gains through his university studies, connections with professors, connections with experts and leaders in different fields, connections with future employers, connections with classmates who become business leaders. Those connections are the real purpose of college study. And if we're going to argue that the academic credentials are important in the first place, then the quality of those academic credentials must also be considered. And so it's true. One can gain admission to a college without any significant academic achievement. That's true. There are private colleges, local colleges, that will accept anyone who's willing to pay the tuition, especially if they're low income and can qualify for government financial aid. Even better. It's true. To go to such a school, you don't need to achieve very much academically. They'll let you in and exchange 4 years of your time and thousands of dollars for a degree. That's certainly true. But when you get that degree, what will you do next? The answer to that question is the difference between a great university and a cheesy, easy college. Just to give you an example from my own experience. When I was at Rutgers University, which is the State University of New Jersey, being a Rutgers University student also gave me access to all of the resources at Princeton University, which is one of the best universities in the world. I wasn't smart enough or organized as far as my life was concerned to study at Princeton, but I was still able to actually study at Princeton, even though I wasn't admitted to Princeton. Rutgers offered me many advantages. I had leading professors in classics and ancient history and education, men who were doing important research all over the world, who were involved in archaeological works in Israel, in Greece, in Italy. One professor who was the world's expert on ancient money and coinage. Another professor who led an archaeological dig in Phoenicia, in Bible lands. And my mentor in education was an older man who was actually head of the state Department of Education that managed the curriculum of the public schools in the state of New Jersey. So I was well connected with influential scholars, and I received many benefits as a result of those connections. I started out as a pre-medical student, and the university's science department had a connection with local research laboratories that provided me with a lab job working for a professor from the Harvard University School of Medicine. And as I was preparing to go to medical school myself, the university connected me with leading scholars in medical research, which was important for my plans for applying to medical school. The university provided those connections for me, and I can still remember that when I would go into an office in a situation like that and introduce myself, they would be very happy to have a Rutgers student in for the job. But even more importantly, when I decided to abandon my plans for medical school because I really felt called and motivated to pursue a career in education, my professors in both the education department and in the classics department provided me with references that allowed me to find full-time work before I even had my degree. These were the benefits of the connections that I gained from a great university. And Rutgers is not even top shelf, but still, it's a Big Ten university in one of the most influential conferences among universities, connections with all kinds of other institutions, located just outside New York City. All of those resources. And being at Rutgers University radically influenced my life. But, and here's the important part, the reason why the professors helped me, the reason why the professors went out of their way to help me and to make their connections available to me was because of how I studied. I wasn't a student who checked the boxes. I wasn't a student who was content to get my B's and C's to get my degree. I was a student who went in to score 100% on every single exam I took. I earned the respect of my professors, and when I did that, they went out of their way to to use all of their connections and resources to help me. And so I want to make a distinction. I'd like to make two distinctions that I think are important. First of all, there's a distinction between schools in that some schools have great connections and resources, while others don't. And another distinction is that there's a distinction within schools among students, among the elite students and the average students. The ideal situation is to be an elite student at an excellent school. Because the benefits of the university, after all, if we are going to say that modern academic credentials matter, we have to ask, why do they matter? What benefits do they actually bring us? What benefits do they bring us? You can get that degree, but what do you do next? That's the difference between a great university and a cheesy, easy local college. So getting that degree doesn't solve the problem, because millions of students in America are getting degrees. And everyone knows that many of these degrees are just a matter of going to class and paying tuition, because you're going to get C's unless you try to do worse. And the college degrees are no longer respected as if it's a sign of some kind of great academic achievement. What matters is the quality of your degree, where you went to school, what school you were admitted to when you applied, what school's connections and resources you have access to, and then ultimately, who your connections are. And if you're going to dismiss all of those things as insignificant, then I'd like to know why you don't also dismiss the college degree itself as insignificant, or the high school diploma as insignificant. Why not keep going? I think this leads to a contradiction. And so this second option of neglecting classical Catholic studies and pursuing modern academic credentials has a real problem to it, because the selective universities giving out these academic credentials don't want students who are merely pursuing the normal modern K-12 curriculum. That's not what they want. The selective universities are not going to be impressed with an average high school education, with the normal course of studies. And so in pursuing less, in aiming lower, you're going to be denied to the more selective colleges and universities, which offer you the greatest benefits for your life after college. And if you were to go to those colleges and ask, what should I do to prepare myself for admission into your selective university with all of these amazing benefits and resources, that institution is going to tell you, as they say on all of their admissions information pages and publications, they're going to say, pursue the most challenging course of study available to you. Don't settle for what's required. Don't settle for what's good enough for your high school diploma. Don't settle for what you hear are the minimum requirements for college admission. The best schools, the respectable colleges and universities, where it actually means something to be admitted, all of them are telling you to pursue the most challenging course of studies you can find. And there's no question but that the classical Catholic curriculum is the most challenging, the most extraordinary, the most unique and distinguishing course of studies available anywhere. That can't be denied. And so for this second option, as I've said, if anyone would claim that they are not going to pursue a classical Catholic education because they are concerned about modern academic credentials, the people in control of those modern academic credentials, or at least in control of the most valuable of those modern academic credentials, are telling you to pursue the most challenging course of studies possible. So you're stuck in a contradiction. To choose to study less and blame it on modern academic credentials is not supportable. In fact, you're contradicting yourself. So that second option, which everyone is pursuing today, is unreasonable. Now, what we find, unfortunately, among many Catholic students is an attempt to justify attending a low-quality college or university because it's, quote-unquote, a Catholic college. And Catholic religion is used to justify the low standards of a private college. Of course, the colleges try to use Catholicism as an advertising tool, as a marketing gimmick to try to attract Catholic students. But it's merely a tuition business. The standards are low. The resources are minimal. The connections are non-existent. They're simply selling college degrees. And they're claiming that because there's a Catholic name on that degree, it should be of special value to Catholic students. But let me ask you, where are you intending to use that degree? Are you planning to use that degree within a private Catholic economy? Are you planning to use that degree within a similar, low standards, private Catholic employment market? Or are you planning to take that degree and go out into the broader market and seek employment and seek to be influential outside of the Catholic community? And the answer is obviously yes, that is the intention. The intention is to get that degree to work in the world. And if that's your intention in the long run, then you're kidding yourself to pretend that the low standard private college is valuable because it's Catholic. We don't go to college to be Catholic. Every college, every university has a Catholic presence, has Catholic campus groups and organization, has local churches where students attend and participate in the sacramental life. Every college has Catholic ministries, Catholic groups, Catholic churches. It makes absolutely no sense to choose a college preparing for a future career in the secular world because the college claims to be Catholic. There's no need for that. If you're going to study accounting, you don't need to be in a Catholic university. If you're going to study education and you're going to work in a public school or in a modern Catholic school, there's no need to study in a Catholic college. The licensing required for the Catholic schools is ordinary secular state licensing. There's no advantage in studying education at a Catholic college, especially a Catholic college with low standards. And to pretend that it's valuable because it's a Catholic college, as if you couldn't be a Catholic somewhere else. I became a Christian at Rutgers University. I didn't start out as a Christian and then go and find some sheltered, private Christian college and learn to be a Christian. I became a Christian at a secular state university. And I believe that the confidence that I have as a Christian, my level of comfort discussing Christianity, my ability to engage in the modern secular world as a Christian are owed to having had to learn to be a Christian in a secular, diverse, modern environment when I was in college. I believe I owe a lot of my success to the fact that I attended a secular, competitive, challenging, diverse university and became a strong Christian there. Argued with professors, argued with classmates, led Christian campus activities, argued with leaders from other anti-Christian groups on campus, represented the Christian community on campus. Those were challenging and formative experiences that made me who I am. And I wouldn't want to be in an exclusively Christian environment to learn how to be a Christian in the world. It's one thing to say children should attend a Christian elementary school or a Christian middle school or even a Christian high school. But when we reach adulthood, it's time for us to live according to our own convictions, stand on our own feet, and act like adults. And I believe that if a 19-year-old is indeed a Christian, is indeed a Catholic, for the right reasons, from the right motives, with the right intentions, there's nothing in this world that's going to lead him or her away from that true faith. And I don't believe this argument that we should go to a low-quality school because it's Catholic. If it was truly Catholic, then I believe it would be a high-quality school. If it was truly Catholic, then I believe it would be a leading school. I don't believe it would have low standards. I don't believe it would be admitting kids who can't get admitted elsewhere. If it was a school filled with the light and grace of Catholic life, I don't understand why it would be an inferior school. And I think that's a sign that something's wrong. So the second option, this idea of pursuing modern academic credentials instead of or without classical Catholic studies, I think, is a fraud. It's an excuse to simply do less. And the people who choose to live like that, the people who choose to study like that, need colleges that are designed to work like that. And if that's what you want to simply make excuses and blame doing less on Catholicism, and then look for private colleges where all of those who do less in the name of Catholicism can gather together and continue to do less together in the name of Catholicism, well, there are plenty of schools for you to do that. But I wouldn't be interested in doing that. I would never be interested in having my children do that. I would never be interested in having my children pretend to be something that they're not. When my children tell me they want to do something, for example, when my sons tell me they want to be in the military, then I challenge them and I say, if you're going to be a soldier, then you should study harder than other people. You should work harder. You should be more virtuous, not less, more disciplined. But when I see someone say, I'm not going to study classical liberal arts or philosophy because I'm going to be joining the military, I see someone who's using the military and its low admission standards as an excuse to do less. And that's what modern Christian society does. It blames its own laziness, its own ignorance, its own cowardice. It blames that on Christianity and pretends that it's somehow virtuous or holy to study less, to accomplish less, to work less diligently. And it's simply not true. Christianity, like St. Paul says, the kingdom of God is not of talk, but of power. Where is this grace? Where is this power? Where is this wisdom? Where is this strength in the Christian community when we watch it constantly settle for lower standards in the name of that Christianity? It should be the opposite. And in history, it was the opposite. Christianity was the source of the higher standards. Christianity was where the most rigorous studies were promoted. Christianity was where the highest standards of personal discipline were taught. in modern Christianity, where Christianity is in decline, in retreat, and in many places in surrender mode, just handing over all of the achievements of past generations to unbelievers, it's popular to lower the standards and pretend you're doing it for Jesus' sake. That you're working less for Jesus. You're studying less for Jesus. I simply don't believe that's true. I believe you're using Jesus as an excuse to simply be and do less. So that second option is a fraud. The third option is to pursue classical Catholic studies, but not care about or dismiss modern academic credentials. The third option, let me repeat that, the third option is to pursue classical Catholic studies, but dismiss modern academic credentials. This is another fraud. When I became a Christian while I was a college student, Christianity challenged me to become a thoughtful, literate, hardworking, responsible person. My Christian faith made me better at school than my peers. My Christian faith led me away from wasting time at parties and in idleness. My Christian faith filled me with a desire for heaven that made me want to study, that made me love solitude for the sake of study and meditation. My Christian faith made me responsible, made me disciplined, gave me motivation to work hard. My Christian faith made me a successful student in a secular university, and my Christian faith caused me to win honors from a secular university because my Christian faith made me a better student, a better worker. It allowed me to achieve more, even though those achievements were not my objective. Those achievements were corollary as I simply worked out my salvation and did what I believed was God's will for a Christian, which was to study and work. As I studied and worked for the sake of wisdom, for the sake of enriching my knowledge so that I could study the scriptures, so that I could work honestly and have skill to earn an honest living and not have to deal with any sleazy jobs or work that contradicted the golden rule, my Christian faith made me more successful in secular activities. Again, even though I didn't pursue that as my objective, it was corollary. In other words, as I grew in discipline and wisdom as a Christian, I acquired other benefits without directly seeking them. They were corollary benefits. And that's why when people come around talking about how they're pursuing Christian wisdom and virtue, and that's somehow leading them to be less successful in secular affairs than their peers, I say baloney. There was an old saying that a philosopher could always find $1. And the meaning of that was, if a man was truly a wise man, if a man was truly wise and not just full of baloney, if he was truly wise, he could get money or resources whenever he needed them because he's a wise man. He could be successful in business, but he simply doesn't devote himself to that. He could be a profit-making worker, but he doesn't necessarily devote himself to that. But when the time comes and when it's necessary, he can easily, quote-unquote, turn on the faucet and get some money because he is a skillful, virtuous, wise man. The colleges of the world, the universities of the world, the businesses of the world are looking for wise, virtuous men. Men who pursue the virtues of the Christian life, and just think about what they are: prudence, courage, justice, temperance, faith, hope, charity. A man whose life is filled with those things is going to be coveted by employers, by university admissions boards, and so on, because he is a unique, valuable, virtuous person. Such a person is not going to be struggling all the time to accomplish anything in the secular world. And if he can't accomplish anything in the secular world, then on what grounds does he claim to be a wise man? St. Paul was an evangelist, the greatest missionary in the history of the church. But when Paul needed money, he could get it. He could turn on the faucet, as it were. He could find $1 because he could easily learn a skill. When we read in Psalm 1 about the blessed man, the man who does not walk in the counsel of the ungodly, the man who meditates on God's law day and night, what kind of man do we read about? A struggling, confused man who can't make a living? No. A man who can't gain admission to college or succeed at the university? No, that's not what we read about. Psalm 1 says, everything that he does shall prosper. Why? Because he's truly wise. He's truly virtuous. And his virtues translate almost by accident into temporal success. He doesn't necessarily pursue that success, but he pursues it when it's necessary, and he isn't ashamed to do so. He doesn't play this game where he mocks worldly achievements as if they're stupid. He understands the place that they have in life. Like Aristotle explains, resources are necessary for happiness. Aristotle explains in the Ethics that wealth and friends, material resources are necessary for good works. You can't clothe the naked if you have no money. You can't feed the hungry if you have no food. You can't give shelter to the shelterless if you yourself can't afford a house. The virtuous man is led to prosperity by his virtue. And the difference is that he simply shares it. That's why he's not wealthy. He's not poor because he's incapable of gaining wealth. He's poor because he shares his wealth. He's poor because he does things according to the golden rule. He doesn't exploit people's needs. He doesn't exploit people's weaknesses. Like Thomas More was famous because while he was working in the courts of England, he couldn't be bribed. He would take the cases of the poor just as he would take the cases of the wealthy and accept no gifts, no payments, because he treated everyone equally. That cost him money. But he never lacked money. He didn't lack temporal success. He was a successful, wealthy, virtuous man. And yet, he was a simple man who could, if necessity actually required, willingly give it all up for the sake of conscience. That doesn't mean that he couldn't obtain it or that he lived without it when no one required him to do so. Like Solomon says in the book of Ecclesiastes, it's the gift of God to enjoy the fruits of one's labors. But a virtuous man is not interested in carnal pleasure or excess. He's not trying to keep up with the Joneses. He's a wealthy man, but he's a simple man. A wise man has everything that he needs and lives in simplicity. He works, like St. Paul says, he works that he may share. And his simplicity of life is not produced by an inability to achieve things. Quite the opposite. He's usually pursued by men in the world because of his wisdom and virtue. And he chooses to live a balanced life. He lives in voluntary simplicity, or what the Romans used to call simple austerity. That's the life of the virtuous man. But in modern circles, we find men who call themselves philosophers, who call themselves lovers of wisdom, who can't figure out how to do anything practical in the world, and yet imagine that they have some kind of supernatural or transcendent wisdom. But it doesn't work like that. A man who knows greater things will also know lesser things. A man who can acquire skill in superior arts will also be capable of performing the inferior arts. And no one should use any feigned wisdom or idle study or interest in literature as an excuse for temporal failure. John Henry Newman, in his work on the idea of the university, and I quote this all the time because he expresses it all not only very well, but he does so in the modern times. He says that there are many who pretend to be interested in learning, in real study, he calls it, but are simply lovers of reading. They're like kids who like to watch cartoons or television shows. Books for them are just entertainment, and what they're looking for is to always read something new and entertaining. They want to brag about how many books they've read, not actually study the important books. This is not real study, and yet this is what most men are interested in who claim to be intellectuals, who claim to be interested in philosophy and religion, and yet who can't figure out how to do anything in the real world, as if the real world is more confusing and more difficult than the Christian life. We see these men with households that are upside down. The wife bears the burden of working for money because she's willing to just go get a job and work and not play these dopey games, pretending she's some kind of nun or philosopher. She knows the kids need food and there isn't enough money for what the family needs, so she takes whatever job she can find and goes and earns a paycheck while her husband theorizes about the economy and doesn't make a dollar. And this is common. I had a man once contact me in the academy claiming that he was get this, a philosopher. That's how he introduced himself. He introduced himself as a philosopher. This was a Catholic homeschool father. He introduced himself as a philosopher. And he wanted to talk to me because he was concerned about the petty school lessons, because he believed that I was teaching nominalism in the petty school lessons. Now, I'm an Aristotelian. Everyone who looks even for 10 seconds at the academy curriculum, who knows anything about philosophy, would know that I am an Aristotelian. I am not a nominalist. But this philosopher, trying to pretend that he was too wise for the petty school program, wrote to complain. This was a guy who, as I learned more about him, because I found it pretty entertaining, as I learned more about him, I found out that he was unemployed. He had 4 or 5 kids, and his wife was scrambling to do whatever she could to make money. They were living with, maybe it was his father, and he was basically doing nothing while making babies, calling himself a philosopher, and troubling me about the content of petty school lessons. This is the Christian so-called philosopher in the modern circle. He spent his time reading books about philosophy, and within a couple of years, his wife had left him, and he was left with nothing. This is the kind of person that I'm warning about. People who claim to have an interest in philosophy and yet can't figure out how to live a simple secular life. Christianity didn't invent the household. It didn't invent government. It didn't invent the life of contemplation. Socrates was a contemplative, and he was married with children. Xenophon, 300 plus years before Christ, wrote a treatise on household economics explaining how the family should be ordered for a happy and prosperous family life. This wasn't a Christian revelation. This wasn't an achievement or a state of life that required sacramental grace. A well-ordered household is a natural achievement of a reasonable man. And when we find men who, in the name of Christianity, can't even manage a household, we can be sure that any claim they make to be interested in philosophy is a smokescreen. They're simply busybodies. The kind of men that St. Paul told should not be allowed to eat unless they go and work. If a man, or let's say a young man or a student, devotes himself to true classical Catholic studies, not all the fake stuff that's sold in modern homeschool programs and even in private schools. If someone devotes himself to true classical Catholic education and gets real wisdom and cultivates real virtue, he's going to have no problem picking up all of the modern academic credentials along the way. They're almost going to be handed to him. He's going to acquire them accidentally as he lives out the Christian life. He's not going to struggle to gain temporal successes. He's not going to struggle in competition with his less wise and less virtuous peers. And so this third option, like the second option, is a fraud. And just to summarize real quick, the first option was to neither pursue classical studies nor modern academic credentials. And we said that's obviously the least desirable of the four options. The second option was to avoid classical Catholic studies, and to do so because one claims to be concerned with modern academic credentials, which is contrary to what those in control of those modern academic credentials have to say. So that's an unreasonable position. The third position is for a man to say that he's pursuing true classical Catholic studies and yet has no interest in modern academic credentials, and I explained that that's unreasonable because if a man pursues true classical Catholic studies, the worldly achievements which are inferior to classical Catholic studies and easier to obtain are going to be easy to pick up along the way, and no one would despise them because they're useful. Aristotle explains this, as I said, in the Ethics. No one would despise modern academic credentials or any worldly benefits when they're easy to obtain for a wise and virtuous man. And so we're left with just one option. And I would argue that this is the only option that any respectable, virtuous, hard-working Christian person would acknowledge to be worth choosing. And that is to pursue the study of the classical Catholic curriculum while also picking up the modern academic credentials along the way. It's the only reasonable option. It's the only option that actually makes sense, because if a person is sincerely interested in imitating the saints and living like a wise man, if a person's interested in honest, virtuous work in the world, all of the skills that he's going to need for that work are increased by classical Catholic studies. Again, not fake classical studies that we find in modern homeschool programs or in private schools that have no idea what they're talking about, but are talking about Dorothy Sayers and levels of learning and are just playing around with schoolwork. We're talking about real classical Catholic studies. Anyone who's pursuing real classical Catholic studies is going to be separated from his secular peers in wisdom and in virtue. That's why they were pursued all through history by the saints and wise men of church history and pre-Christian history. What we have to ask when we think about academic credentials, modern academic credentials, we have to ask, what do we intend to do with these things? Because as I said, to have a bachelor's degree or even a graduate degree from a cheesy, easy college is not going to make someone successful in any field outside of that college. The challenge of participation in a competitive capitalist market in a global economy that's driven by technology and is therefore global and very competitive is going to demand great wisdom, the ability to think and act quickly, to solve problems, to always be a step ahead of one's peers. Those are the skills that are going to be needed for success. Communication skills, reasoning skills, rhetorical skills, ethical skills, what Aristotle calls the political science. Knowledge of all of these different areas is going to be essential for success. Men are going to need to find an advantage over other men in business, while at the same time serving the common good, working according to the golden rule, and doing everything justly. And this work is going to become increasingly complicated, increasingly difficult, and that's why it's so dangerous that we find Christians working less, studying less, as society actually becomes more and more complicated. The competition becomes greater and greater, and the Christians become weaker and less influential. And that's why we shouldn't be surprised to find Christians resorting to politics and conspiracy theories. Because it's easy to justify your failures when you just claim that the whole world is under captivity to some great global conspiracy and only the faithful ones, only the elect, can't find a job, can't manage a household, can't earn a living, can't maintain an argument, can't live a disciplined life. That becomes the sign of the so-called elect, who are simply being oppressed by these global conspiracies and political movements. We just move from one excuse to the other. And rather than being stronger and wiser and better, the salt and light of the earth, those who overcome the world, Christians become more and more the ones who are in the way. The Christian schools close because they can't figure out how to run in a modern environment where it takes some ingenuity, some problem solving, some creativity, some sacrifice. We have to look and watch as unbelievers do all the problem solving, and the Christians stand around and wait for jobs. The world is becoming more competitive, more challenging. The problems are becoming more complicated, and that should give Christians the advantage. You know, we used to say when I was a kid that when the going gets tough, the tough get going. We used to say that pressure makes diamonds. We understand these things, or at least we used to. I know I was taught these things. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. And we're finding that the Christians aren't the tough for some reason. The Christians are the soft ones. The Christian men are increasingly effeminate. They're talking about food and clothing, talking about sports and games. They're not the virtuous men. They're not the heroic men in our society. They're studying less. They're working less, doing less. achieving less. And these times, as the going gets tough, these times are challenging us to get going. To be a Christian needs to mean that you accept the challenge to do more. To be a Christian means that you need to accept the challenge to study harder, to study longer, to study more challenging subjects, to study the stuff everyone else is too lazy to study. To study the subjects that the other students can't even comprehend because they have no place in a secular, materialistic life, but for a Christian whose thoughts are in heaven, they're his own native language, the language of saints and wise men. That's how Christians are supposed to live. And therefore, when we consider why we should study the classical Catholic curriculum in the 21st century, it's because there's never been a time where it was more important to study the classical Catholic curriculum than in the 21st century. And the more uncommon it is, the more unpopular it is, the more difficult it is, the more we see just how honorable and virtuous a course of study it is. Fewer and fewer men even know where to begin, let alone make progress in it. And so rather than following the crowd into weaker and dumber culture, instead of joining the political movements that live promoting conspiracy theories and making excuses, Christians need to be the ones who step up, who take on the greater challenges, and by the graces that they receive through the Christian life, which they claim is a supernatural life, they should be the ones who are able to accomplish supernatural things. They should be able to do both. And it's not as hard as people pretend, because if we commit to one, that is, if we commit to classical Catholic studies, we'll also get the other. In the 21st century, it's going to take heroic men to undertake these studies to restore real Catholic learning, the only kind of Catholic learning that there is. There's no alternative. What's the alternative to the learning of the saints and the fathers and the doctors of the church? What's the alternative? There's no alternative. We're either pursuing that wisdom and that knowledge and that virtue, or we're not. There's no alternative. And as the times go on, as the workplace gets more complicated, more challenging, more competitive, the demand for wiser and better men becomes greater. And this shouldn't be a problem for Christians. This should give Christians an advantage in the world. And by answering this challenge, by stepping up as things get more difficult, Christians should be able to separate themselves from their graceless peers and do more. And when they do so, it should bear witness to the truth that they talk about. which is that Christ came into the world to save us from our sins and give us the grace of the Holy Spirit so that we can do works like He did. Works like the apostles did. Works like the early martyrs of the church did. Works like the saints and fathers and doctors of church history did. Those are the works that we need to do, and it only makes sense that those of us who are willing to undertake those works should have the education of the men who in history have performed those same works. And so, only a person looking for an excuse to do less would even ask the question, why do we need to study the classical Catholic curriculum in the 21st century?